Hi, and welcome back to Inns Division. I'm Glenn Reynolds, and today we've got one of our most popular guests on the show. We've had him a number of times, and people always seem to be really happy to have him here, and I sure am. It's Michael Barone. He's a resident fellow at AEI. He's the co-author of the Almanac of American Politics, and his newest book, just out, is Shaping Our Nation: How Surges of Migration Transformed America and Its Politics. Welcome, Michael. It's great to have you here.
Hey, it's great to be with you again, Glenn, and I guess I should mention also I'm the Washington Examiner as well.
You note that people talk about America as having recently become culturally diverse, when really it's been that way all along. Tell us about that.
Well, the Founding Fathers were very much aware that their new nation was culturally diverse. I mean, the colonies had different origins. Their original settlers had different mixtures of political and religious beliefs at a time when those two things were very closely intertwined. So they were very different from Puritan Massachusetts on the one hand. The Anglican Cavaliers of Virginia were very different. Those two groups in Britain had fought a civil war against each other. Then you had Quaker-founded Philadelphia and Pennsylvania, and Dutch-founded New York. So the founders were very much aware of that, and that's one of the reasons why the Constitution proposes there be no religious test for office. That was the opposite of the case in Great Britain, and why the First Amendment says Congress shall make no law regarding a religious establishment. The states had religious establishments. Madison and Jefferson campaigned to disestablish the Anglican Church of Virginia, and successfully. We had an established church in Massachusetts as late as 1833, supported by taxes. So the founders knew it was a culturally diverse country, and it was also getting even more diverse. Just before the Revolution, in the 12 years before the Revolution, from the end of the French and Indian Wars to Lexington and Concord, you had a huge surge of migration of what I call the Scots-irish. People from of Scottish origin, usually from Northern Ireland, from the lowlands of Scotland, the northern counties of Britain. These were fighting peoples. Their British landlords were sorry to see their tenants leave. It was an unpredicted migration, like other surges of migration. And the city fathers in Philadelphia, where they tended to land, were kind of ill at ease with these unruly people, and they were happy when they went off to the frontier, went down the Shenandoah Valley, through the Appalachians, down into North Carolina, South Carolina, Southwest Virginia, and then into what became Kentucky and, yes, Glenn, Tennessee.
You don't have to tell me about the Scots-Irish role in settling Tennessee. That's, it's interesting because this echoes, there was a really good book, Albion Seed, Four English Folkways in America, which traces a lot of American political traditions to those groups of initial English settlers. But then there were all the non-English, there were a lot of Germans.
Well, you have surges of immigrant migration that happen after the early years of the Republic. Suddenly in the 1840s, you have huge numbers, as compared to the pre-existing population, of Irish Catholics and Germans, something like 1.5 million of each coming in a dozen years, coming into a nation that started off at just 20 million. That was a huge injection of people. It was totally unexpected, triggered in Ireland by the potato famine, which was also something of a factor in Germany, as well as the failed revolutions of 1848. And they start transforming the character of the country. The Irish, unlike previous settlers, settle in the big cities largely, in industrial factory towns. So you've got Germans settling there too, but they also fan out and farm in the Midwest, so that Wisconsin, Iowa, Minnesota, the Dakotas become a kind of Germano-Scandinavian province of America by the late 20th century. And that has its influence on politics as well. That old Northwest, as it was called, Germano-Scandinavian America, has always been the most pacifist or isolationist or dovish part of the country. And one hypothesis is that the Germans, who came from, a war-tossed area in Europe, the ones who came here were the ones that didn't like wartime and militarism and wanted to get away from it by going into the interior of North America.
Yes, they'd had a bad experience in the 30 Years' War and the Napoleonic Wars and various other conflicts, and I can see why they'd want to do it. And that, of course, brings us sort of Fritz Mondale.
That's right. Walter Mondale, whose father was a Norwegian-American minister, as a matter of fact, and not a pacifist in the case of Vice President Mondale, but one who did appeal to the dovish part of the Democratic Party. And you know, the Democrats had three nominees from that region: Hubert Humphrey, George McGovern, and Walter Mondale. None of them successful in the nation as a whole, however, because we're made up of parts of people, some of whom can be very warlike when they feel they or their family are attacked, which is your friends and not mine, the Scots-Irish.
Absolutely, absolutely. And actually, those waves of migration in Tennessee are interesting because Tennessee, according even to its state constitution, is divided into three regions of East, West, and Middle, with like quotas for Supreme Court justices from each region, and they're very distinct. East Tennessee is much more Scots-Irish. West Tennessee, which had more sort of a plantation economy, much less so, and Middle is sort of a, so it's had that effect even within my state. It's a very obvious phenomenon here.
Yeah, the original 13 colonies each had its own kind of distinct origins, but the internal migrations of the country swept across state boundaries, and they set up a real conflict. You mentioned that Memphis and West Tennessee, plantation. This is part of the economy, what I call the Southern plantation grandees, who in the early mid-19th century moved themselves, their families, and their slaves in very large numbers from the Atlantic seaboard to the Mississippi Valley. And Memphis, of course, was the great cotton trading center near the delta of Mississippi. These people wanted to continue to extend slavery. The big planters amassed huge wealth. The wealthiest county in the country in the 1860 census was Natchez, Mississippi, Adams County, Mississippi, where you have great mansions of the slaveholders. A different and parallel migration at about that same time is what I call the New England Yankee diaspora. People of Yankee stock had been sort of isolated up in New England. They were pretty ornery to others that tended to move there. They were moralistic, and they liked to tell other people what to do in terms of their moral code. After the American Revolution, the barrier to their moving westward disappeared. In the colonial times, the British had a kind of alliance with the Iroquois Indians, and the basic message was, well, if you, the Iroquois, keep the French out of the Hudson Valley, we, the British, will keep those pesky New Englanders out of what is now upstate New York. Well, the Yankees spread westward to upstate New York. It becomes a kind of Yankee province. They go to northeast Ohio, the Western Reserve, which for a time was owned by Connecticut, where you still see New England-style town greens and covered bridges. Southern Michigan, Chicago is founded by Yankee merchants who were eager to do good and do well. And in the process, they invent things like the futures market, build canals, reverse the flow of the Chicago River, and so forth. The Yankees were moralistic and reform-minded. They took up ideas, outlandish ideas, like the women's rights movement. Seneca Falls, New York, and upstate New York is a part of the Yankee province there. They bring up causes like temperance. We're going to abolish alcohol. The state of Maine does this in 1855, the Maine Law. And that spreads westward as well. And then you have the idea that we should abolish slavery, another outlandish idea which the Yankees propagate. And the Yankees want to stop the spread of slavery. They don't want it going into the territories. And they form the Republican Party as their instance to do so. It's one that runs candidates only in the North. And when they win with Abraham Lincoln, the Southern planters and their neighbors vote to secede, and we have the Civil War.
Now, fast forwarding roughly 100 years, you say one of America's biggest migrations internally was the flow out of big cities in the 1970s and 1980s, especially New York. Why did that happen?
Well, I think there's a one-word answer to that, Glenn: crime. Basically, one of the things you see is that between 1965 and 75, the rates of violent crime roughly tripled in the United States. And of course, it was concentrated in the big cities. Unhappily, a disproportionate percentage of those crimes were committed by young black men. Blacks accounted for more than 40% of violent crimes at that time. This was one of the ancillary results, one of the unhappy results, there were happy ones as well, of the great northward migration from of about 1/3 of American blacks from the rural South to the urban North in just one generation. Nobody expected it to start. It did in 1940 when defense plants were seeking warfare. Nobody expected it to stop, which it did in 1965 after the civil rights laws were passed and after the first urban riots in New York, in big cities. But the first generation of blacks that moved north did not produce higher crime rates. A very interesting fact. But you get higher crime rates, and what happens is that other people leave the central cities and move out to the suburbs. And in addition, starting in 1970, you have what I call volitional migration. You have migration from high tax localities, high cost of living, high real estate value localities to lower real estate localities. So metropolitan New York in the 40 years between 1930 and 1970 grew faster than the national average. You know, the Time and Fortune writers used to write these stories about the suburbs that are going up overnight, and they went out to Long Island in New Jersey and found them there. Well, between 1970 and 2010, there's been basically no net growth in Metro New York. It's a high tax, high land price, high real estate area. People have been going elsewhere. Immigrants have been moving in from abroad. That's a surge of migration that wasn't predicted. But people who are domestic residents have been moving out to places like Florida in particular, but also to places like Texas and Tennessee. All three of those states do not have an income tax, and they have been above average growers in the last 40 years.
Final question on immigration in general. Eugene Volokh wrote a while back, he's a law professor at UCLA, familiar to most of our viewers, I'm sure, that in a democracy, when you let in immigrants, it means you're letting in your future rulers. And your analysis kind of supports that, as waves of people go to different places and change their political character. Should that influence today's immigration policy?
Well, I think it does. We've had differing immigration policies in the history of the Republic. In the first 100 years of the Republic, immigration was basically a state matter. States regulated it, not the federal government. They kept out people for public health reasons and because they felt they would be a charge on the public, that they would be on the equivalent of local welfare relief. They were kept out. Ellis Island opened in 1892. The federal government took on that responsibility, so we did have public health regulations. And what we found in Ellis Island after 1892 until outbreak of World War I in 1914, there was a huge migration, as large, proportionate to pre-existing population of that as the Scots-Irish in the before the Revolution, and or the Irish and Germans in the 1840s and 50s. Huge, coming from the southern and eastern Europe, sort of the second-class ethnic peoples of multi-ethnic empires. Southern Italians from a northern-run Italy, Serbs, Slovaks, Poles, and Jews from the Austro-Hungarian, Russian, and German empires. And there was concern about could they be assimilated into American life. I think the answer is yes. I think they were generally. Heroic efforts were made by the public schools to teach people to learn, read, and write English, teach them basic math. I've often said that if I could have a time machine, one of the things I do to improve education today in America is to bring back the people that ran the New York City public schools 100 years ago. They had better ideas and better performance in many cases. We cut off immigration in 1924 by act of Congress. They basically said we have country quotas which are proportionate to the ethnic share of the population of the 1890 census before the opening of Ellis Island. So we shut that door. Some people claim that that pause in immigration assisted assimilation. I think that events would have gone forward more or less the same way anyway, because you do not have major immigration or internal migration in times of economic distress like the 1930s. And then we had the great assimilationist force of World War II. World War II brought Americans together. The North and the South, which had been almost separate countries with almost no movement between them between the Civil War and World War II, were suddenly one country again. The Ellis Islanders were very much part of the unit, and those old kind of hokey World War II movies where, you know, one of the guys in the outfit was from Brooklyn, were actually demographically accurate. 2% of Americans lived in Brooklyn in 1940 census, 1 out of every 50. So that was an accurate reflection. They were brought together. They were brought, that had, I think, a tremendous assimilation effect. You get the culturally more uniform America of post-war America of the 1950s and early 60s, and that war experience, putting 16 million men and a few women in uniform. The equivalent proportionate to population today would be 38 million, something that we simply can't imagine. That was a profound effect. I think we're doing a pretty good job on assimilation of immigrants today, not as good as we did 100 years ago. Some of these people who proclaim multiculturalism and let's let them keep their own culture are not following the American tradition that has worked. So I think we need to work on that. But we don't have an event that has on the horizon, and I guess, thank goodness we don't, that has the kind of annealing effect that World War II did. That was such a big experience, and I don't think it can be duplicated, and obviously we don't want a world war if we can possibly avoid one.
No, no world war, no alien invasion, nothing like that, even if it would bring us together. Well, thank you for taking time to join together with us here.
Well, thank you, Glenn. Thanks very much. Always a great pleasure to be with you.
And that's Michael Barone. His new book is Shaping Our Nation, How Surges of Migration Transformed America and Its Politics. It's a fascinating read, and I strongly encourage you to pick up a copy and take a look. And that's all for this episode of InstaVision. I'm Glenn Reynolds. We'll be back next week. In the meantime, have fun on the internet.